Prime Minister Mark Carney discussed a number of issues, including shifting trade relationships, market conditions, and supply chains. A statement from his office reads, Prime Minister Carney and the leaders discussed ongoing negotiations with the United States and the work to pursue a deal by July 21st. They discussed the impacts on the sector and the need to build up a made-in-Canada supply chain, as well as diversify our trading partners. The Prime Minister underscored the federal measures to safeguard Canadian auto workers and businesses from unjust tariffs and the adjustment of counter tariffs on July 21st based on the state of negotiations. Prime Minister Carney affirmed that the government's focus remains on securing the best deal for Canadian workers and industries. So with the meeting over and talks with Washington set to resume this week, where does that leave car makers and consumers? To talk about that, I want to welcome consultant Stephen Beatty to the program. He's a former corporate vice president of Toyota Canada. And Stephen, appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
So we are less than 3 weeks from that deadline. How much or how little should we read into today's meeting?
Well, I think today's meeting reminds me of the old saying, if you've got a good case, pound the facts. If you've got a bad case, pound the table. I think the D3 were in Ottawa pounding the table. Because basically what they've been looking for, and if you listen to the presidents of both Ford and General Motors, they've been very supportive of the tariff strategy taken by the president. So I think what they were looking for from Ottawa was an assurance that there'd be an early conclusion to the talks, that it would go something along the lines of the deal that the UK worked out with the US, perhaps with lower tariffs overall, maybe around the 5% range. But at the same time, they'd be looking to get assurances from Canada that there'd be no duties on vehicles coming into the country, and that Canada would get rid of its zero-emission vehicle mandate. And I wasn't in the meeting, but I have the feeling that those were the things being discussed.
And do you think any of this is going well?
Well, I guess it depends on whose perspective you're looking at it from. The reality of it is that I think Donald Trump, is right in one aspect. He says that the U.S. doesn't need our cars, and it's absolutely true. There are lots of cars built around the world, and frankly, the size of the U.S. market has been shrinking over the last couple of decades, not growing. The problem is the U.S. does need one thing from Canada, and that is it's our market. So if you look at the companies, for example, that were represented in the room today, they produced about, a little less than 30% of the vehicles produced in Canada last year. Honda and Toyota made the other 70+%. So in fact, each of the, old line manufacturers are actually major importers into the country. So what they're looking for is assurance that there's not going to be a disruption to their Canadian marketplace. And they need that because there is exactly one good export market for the U.S., and that's Canada. You can't think of any other market around the world that would accept the number of full-size pickup trucks that Canada purchases every year. So without us, their industry's in trouble.
I mean, I don't know whether that matters to Trump, though, right? I mean, in terms of the way he talks and the way he thinks.
See, I think this is the point, is that in any discussion with automakers, there's a need to get them engaged in the lobbying on the U.S. side of the border. And in particular, to make it very clear that there are U.S. jobs on the line in all of this. So if, for example, 134,000 F-Series pickup trucks aren't going to be sold next year in Canada because of tariffs on our side, then you suddenly have the makings of more of a negotiation. If this is only about the U.S. and whether or not Canadian cars will come to the U.S., I think it leaves us with a very weak hand. And that concerns me because the Canadian auto industry today is half the size that it was in manufacturing terms as it was in the year 2000. The companies who are in Ottawa today have largely been moving jobs and investment out of the country. We need to leverage it back in place. I think the Prime Minister has the tools that he needs to be able to do that. The question is, where will that go in the negotiations when there's so many other sectors, including steel and aluminum, that are currently under threat?
Do you think that this could be the beginning of the end of the Canadian auto sector, though? I mean, in terms of, is that a potential? And what would that mean for the country?
Well, I think we've been in a long, slow decline, which is unfortunate. My uncle worked for General Motors years ago, and there was a time when Oshawa, where I normally live, was producing over 900,000 vehicles a year. Today, it's a fraction of that, and Canada can produce very highly sophisticated vehicles. We can do it with extraordinary levels of quality, but we can't do it if our hands are tied behind our backs by rules that favor U.S. sourcing. And so that's the discussion here is we have one last good kick at this. And I have to say, what worries me most about the current set of negotiations is this discussion that's happening in Ottawa around maybe a two-staged approach to the talks, where we fix the immediate problem. We come to some sort of interim agreement, and then we agree that we're going to go tackle the big problem in a full renegotiation of USMCA CUSMA. The problem is, if I were a U.S. negotiator and Canada had agreed to some sort of mid-ground solution, I'd just roll that over into the final agreement. And that's what I think is really dangerous for Canada.
You also mentioned, and we also heard one of the key leaders speaking about the EV mandate and how saying that it's just not sustainable. How big a part of the discussion do you think that had, and do you agree?
Well, I think it's been a huge piece of the discussion, and for weeks now, the CVMA member companies and the association have been in Ottawa saying, look, we think you can get a deal if you just throw in the ZEV mandate too, because the White House is so negative about the California mandates. The problem, of course, is this. Of course, zero emission vehicles aren't selling at the rate that they were previously, and we certainly aren't on track to hit the mandated targets federally or in Quebec or BC. But I'm not sure that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's important that Canada continues to have aspirational goals around the environmental performance of vehicles, that we continue to insist on better efficiency out of the vehicles that are sold here. And so a better result than simply throwing away the regulations would be to come up with a new, better, smarter, more market savvy approach to dealing with it. And frankly, if you give up your regulations, you've given up another one of the levers that you can use to control, decisions by industry around jobs and investment. So I would argue against it. I'm certainly not arguing in favor of the existing mandates. They're not working, but it's time to be clever.
If President Trump, getting back to the tariffs more specifically, they're obviously the most immediate threat. What happens if they don't come down and they stay where they are? There's no deal, or the deal in the determination of the Prime Minister is just not good enough?
Well, you already have a number of auto plants that are shut down in Canada. In theory, in the process of retooling to start up again, next year or further into the future. At the same time, you have plants operating on reduced numbers of shifts. And again, all of this is, the industry taking a wait and see approach. I'd mention, incidentally, that that's not true about Honda and Toyota. They've been taking very much a business as usual approach to manufacturing in Canada. So it's possible to take an optimistic view of the market. It is possible to take a constructive view of how to manufacture in this country. It's just not, there's no consensus around it, I would say, amongst the OEMs. So what we need to do next is to think very hard about whether we take an interim better deal than we've got, or hold out and really aim to replace free trade in some meaningful sense. The one thing I would say is you'll hear a lot from the Detroit-based makers about how they want to get something better than the UK style deal. So better than the 10% deal that the United Kingdom got with the US. And basically what they've been saying is, well, maybe we get their 10%, but once you take out the US content in the vehicles, maybe that would be an applied rate of about 5%. To think about what that means, I think Honda last year exported about 335,000 vehicles to the U.S. If those vehicles landed in the U.S. at a landed cost of $30,000, that 5% duty rate would amount to $500 million worth of tariffs. It really doesn't take very long before you've paid to put up a new plant in the United States where those tariffs are behind you. So I think the writing's on the wall. If we have tariffs of any meaningful level, you're seeing the demise of auto assembly in this country. And more importantly, if there's no auto assembly, frankly, there are no parts. So the whole sector starts to go at that point.
It's hard to imagine that would happen, but it's becoming clearer and clearer. It is certainly a possibility if this just goes on and on. Stephen, appreciate you taking the time very much. Thank you. That was former Toyota Canada Vice President Stephen Beatty.